As a professional wildlife and wedding photographer, there are occasions where it's essential that I know how to shoot in manual mode. Just last weekend, on a particularly difficult wedding shoot with no natural light, I had to use these manual shooting skills to the max in order to give my couple acceptable images. Now, this set me thinking, what if I'd not learned how to use manual settings? How would I have managed with an automatic camera setting that simply couldn't cope with the conditions and was unable to provide the exposure I was looking for? So I've come up with the idea of explaining the absolute basics of shooting in manual, just to get you started. Now, this is not going to be an in-depth, graphic-laden, multi-fact-based, hard-to-understand tutorial. Just a simple explanation of how you can make a start to learn how to switch over to manual whenever your automatic settings can't cope with the image you have in your mind. By the end of this video, my aim is to have you to be able to switch your settings to manual and take a decent, well-exposed image. Once you have the basic knowledge in the bag, with practice, you can then progress to more creative photography at your own pace. Hi, I'm Ken Hadfield. Welcome to my Better Photography channel. Before we start, I just want to clarify that this tutorial reflects a method that I chose to use when I first decided to try to shoot in manual mode. There are probably many other opinions and methods around, but this was my chosen path and it worked for me, so that's why I'm sharing it today. I want everyone watching any of my videos to remember just one thing. If you like and enjoy your finished image, it simply doesn't matter how you came to the end product. I don't care how I process my images, as long as I get to the end result I'm looking for. And you know, photo editors and picture agencies, they don't care either, as long as the subject is interesting, saleable, sharp, and the correct resolution for publication. They're not interested in how you processed it. This has been my screensaver for many years, and it's the last slide I show when public speaking. And I do my best to keep it in my mind with all my work. So, manual photography. Well, in my opinion, to be a complete photographer, you need at least a basic understanding of the manual mode. So here we go. Manual mode in simple layman's terms. There are three elements involved when you take a photograph: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, better known as the exposure triangle. Now, I've already explained the exposure triangle in a previous video, so if you're a complete beginner, you may want to follow the link showing at the top of the screen and view that video before returning to watch this one. In the shortest, simplest terms, the shutter speed is the length of time the shutter opens to let light into the camera. The light enters the lens, passes through the aperture and hits the camera sensor. Shutter speeds can range from 30 seconds to 1/8,000th of a second depending on your camera model. But keep in mind, the lowest shutter speed allows more light into the lens, but is not good for moving subjects, as it'll appear blurry. A faster shutter speed allows less light into the lens, but allows you to photograph moving objects without blurring. As a rule of thumb, the faster the subject moves, the faster the shutter speed you'll need. As a rule, for static, non-moving subjects, I use between a 60th to 125th of a second. However, with speeds less than a 60th of a second, I always put the camera on a tripod to avoid camera shake. For slow-moving subjects, I would usually use 125th to 250th of a second. For faster subjects, such as passing cars, I use around 250th to 1/500th of a second, depending on the speed of the car. And really fast-moving objects, I go for a minimum of 1,000th of a second, up to 2,000th of a second plus if I have enough light available, particularly for small, fast-moving animals and birds. Aperture is the opening inside the lens that opens and closes to allow more or less light to hit the sensor. This affects what's known as depth of field. Again, simply explained, just remember, the lower the aperture setting number, the wider the opening, which will give you more blurring behind the subject. The higher the aperture setting, the smaller the opening becomes and the sharper the background becomes. So for any subject that you want to isolate with a blurry background, use the lowest aperture settings available. Mine's 2.8 for a blurry background. Or for a sharper background, use a higher aperture setting, let's say f8, and your background will stay nice and sharp. Just try to remember, lower aperture settings means a blurry background. Higher aperture settings means a sharper background. It's as easy as that to remember. Now the third element is ISO, which simply explained controls the sensitivity of the camera sensor. The ISO range usually starts at ISO 100 and goes up to well over ISO 100,000 on some camera models. But all you need to know is that you need to keep your ISO settings as low as possible, because higher ISO settings will introduce noise into the image. Now noise appears as speckles on the image. These are not obvious on the screen on the back of your camera, but if you zoom into 100% magnification, you'll clearly see coloured speckles spoiling the shot. Because some cameras handle noise better than others, you'll need to take some test shots at different ISO settings to see just how far you can go before the noise becomes unacceptable. However, don't forget, there are some very good noise reducing apps such as Nick Tools Define or Topaz Noise AI. And you can check out my Denoise AI tutorial using the link above. These programs can work wonders for noise removal. So nowadays it's possible to raise the ISO a little higher, then easily remove the noise in post-production. One of the hardest things to understand until you've gained experience is where to start. Which manual settings are your starting point? So here's a great way to work out your initial manual settings. When I was learning, I initially used a shortcut by setting the camera to either an auto aperture or auto shutter speed setting, depending on my subject. I half pressed the shutter to meter the shot, and then, noting the auto settings suggested by the camera, switched to manual mode. I then copied those automatic settings before adjusting my shutter, aperture and ISO controls manually, until I was happy with the exposure. And you must remember the camera will actually tell you if you achieved a proper exposure setting. There's usually an exposure meter on the back of your camera that shows whether you're over or underexposed. Marked in stops, you can see clearly whether you're over or underexposing. Aim for the centre point or as near to it as possible. So here's my method of setting up manual mode exposure. First, set up to suit your subject. Initially, set your ISO to 100. Then if you're shooting a static image, set your preferred aperture setting. Next, set your shutter speed. Check your exposure meter, and if you can balance it in the centre using the shutter settings, when balanced, you should have a good, well-exposed image. If you're unable to achieve a good balanced exposure using only the shutter speed controls, then raise your ISO until the exposure meter balances. So that's for a static subject. But for a moving subject, set your required shutter speed first to avoid motion blur, and then choose your preferred aperture. Fast moving objects will mean the shutter will be opening and closing very quickly, so much less light will hit the sensor, and you may find that your aperture setting may not give the depth of field you're looking for or be sufficient to give a balanced reading on the camera exposure meter. Again, that's when ISO steps in. Use the aperture settings you prefer, then raise the ISO until the meter balances, and you should then achieve a good exposure with the shutter speed and aperture you need for the shot you have in mind. Now, let's face it, these are very basic settings, just to ease you into manual mode, but they're a great starting point. Once you know the basics, well, then you can experiment, play around, and mix up these settings to be more creative on your journey to better photography. See you next time on the Better Photography channel.